Peter Jennings.
Good evening. In Washington today, another effort by the politicians to tip the political scales in their favor before the next budget deadline at midnight tomorrow. On Capitol Hill, there are some hints that the very worst battles of the budget debate may be over. Moreover, congressional leaders have been assured that if there is reasonable progress in narrowing the gap with the White House, Mr. Bush is not going to close the government down again this weekend. And there has been some progress on the Hill, which is where we begin. Here's ABC's Jim Wooten.
In this game of budget chicken, congressional leaders believe the president has blinked, has agreed not to shut down the government Saturday morning, which gives Congress more time to compromise between a deficit reduction package funded mainly by the rich, the House plan, or one less painful for the wealthy, but more acceptable to President Bush. That's the Senate version, ferociously challenged in debate today by liberal Democrats like Mikulski of Maryland.
The middle class in this country has no more to give. The poor have nothing to give, so let's go and get it from those who got it.
But the Senate leadership successfully repulsed changes that might tempt a presidential veto.
It comes back to the same old question. Do you want to make a statement, or do you want to make a law?
The two versions, which would need to be reconciled, seem irreconcilable. The House raises top income tax rates to 33%, imposes a 10% surtax on incomes above $1 million, and offers a modest capital gains tax break to the middle class. The Senate merely limits deductions for the wealthy and proposes a few more tax credits for the poor. The House would freeze for a year all cost of living adjustments on tax rates, which means inflation could move some taxpayers into higher brackets. The Senate doesn't. The House leaves gasoline taxes untouched. The Senate more than doubles them from 9 cents a gallon to 18.5. The word tonight is that House Democrats will focus on lessening the impact of Medicare cuts and gasoline tax increases, and probably won't push the president to the wall on income tax. Combined with this new sense of confidence that he won't shut the government down this weekend, that made this a better day than most in this endless budget process. Jim Wooten, ABC News, Capitol Hill.
The White House said tonight there has been no flip-flop on the issue of signing a bill to keep the government running. But as ABC's Britt Hume reports, the White House position does seem to have evolved over the past few days.
Before a group of White House interns today, the president was talking tough about getting an acceptable budget from Congress at last.
I will hold everyone's feet to the fire and make them, up there, to the best of my ability, do the right thing.
Earlier this week, campaigning for Republicans in Texas, there seemed no doubt what the president meant by such talk. With temporary funding to keep the government open set to expire Friday, Mr. Bush said no more.
Twice now this year, I've signed emergency legislation to add more time to the clock. Well, this Friday, time's up. The American people deserve more than this stopgap government.
But yesterday, Chief of Staff Sununu said Mr. Bush would consider signing a stopgap measure if a final budget were all but complete.
In order to allow I's being dotted and T's being crossed.
But today, with the budget still far from complete, House Appropriations Chairman Whitten moved to extend the current deadline through next Wednesday, saying he was acting on behalf of House leaders.
They have been advised that the president will agree to such an extension.
Tonight, the White House said yes, the president would consider extending the deadline if there were, quote, satisfactory progress on a final budget. That's different from what they were saying yesterday and much different from what the president himself said Monday. Those campaign promises can be hard to keep. Britt Hume, ABC News, the White House.
How many times have you heard the phrase, we live in an interdependent world? Our polls tell us that Americans are more frustrated and angry about this budget process than ever before. And if the spectacle is bewildering, not to mention infuriating to Americans, just imagine what kind of an impression this debate is leaving overseas. ABC's John Donovan has been monitoring it from London.
Rarely have America's economic allies paid this much attention to a U.S. budget battle. Broadcasters from Germany to Japan to Britain wondering what is going on in Washington.
So are we witnessing the terminal decline of the once all-powerful greenback?
I think there's a sense of a lack of leadership over such a critical issue in the largest country in the world.
It is not so much that other world markets fear being dragged down by the U.S. economy, but on the floors of the brokerage houses overseas, fewer people mention the U.S. as a good place to invest now. More speak of the budget process as a shambles.
And it is, in many respects, a shambles, and that is obviously adding to the market's general perception.
The perception that the U.S. is losing economic importance, while other nations like the reunited Germany are gaining. Investors this year have shown less faith in the U.S. dollar than in the German mark or the Japanese yen.
Why shouldn't the U.S. citizen pay a few more cents tax?
Advice Americans have been hearing from abroad for years. Overseas investors are far from writing off the U.S., which is still seen as an enormous, resilient economic power. But one Dutch newspaper is reminded by the budget crisis of the decline of ancient Rome. Already, says the paper, the U.S. is degenerating nicely. John Donovan, ABC News, London.
Further economic fallout from the Gulf. The trade deficit rose $200 million in August to $9.3 billion, and more than half of it was due to the higher cost of imported oil. And consumer prices were up 0.8% last month. Again, half of that rise was because of oil. Social Security benefits, which are adjusted for inflation, are also going up starting in January. The 40 million Americans who receive Social Security checks will get a 5.4% increase, and that is the largest rise in 8.5 years. A strong rally on Wall Street today. The Dow Jones Industrials gained nearly 65 points to close at 2452, and the trading was heavy. In a moment, the other news. The Bedouin of Saudi Arabia wondering if their way of life can survive American firepower in the desert. On the American agenda tonight, the high cost of Medicaid prescriptions and the fear and outrage about an earthquake prediction.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, brought to you by Carnival Cruise Line.